Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Jim. Thanks for your leadership of this great organization. Oliver, thanks for being my interrogator this evening. No enhanced interrogation techniques, please. And thanks for leaving out in that kind introduction that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 during the surge to Vladimir Putin. He also left out that I've been sanctioned by Vladimir Putin for my support of Ukraine. But it's really great to be back here. It's wonderful to be back in a room that is so eerily reminiscent of the East Room. Needless to say, a place that I was privileged to be a number of times during my time in uniform and at the CIA and so forth. And really great to be back with this organization. I think what you've done here at the museum is really more than quite impressive. You've managed to ensure that the American public and visitors from around the world are reminded of the extraordinary achievements of one of America's great leaders, particularly in the realm of foreign policy, and that the events that brought about the end of his government service do not overshadow all of the achievements prior to that time, while still very forthrightly dealing with the events that did lead, again, to his departure from government, but didn't end his influence, because of course he went on to be a very important voice on foreign policy, showing yet again the intellectual rigor that he brought to the positions that he held in the Senate, 8 years as the vice president, and of course our president during a period of extraordinary breakthroughs from the opening China, bringing them away from the Soviet Union, crafting a path out of Vietnam, which he inherited, and a war that had been in many respects mismanaged, as we might discuss at some point in time here. And again, a number of other very significant achievements, together, of course, with one of the great foreign policy figures of our time, a dear friend of mine, Henry Kissinger, who just passed away in the last year. And talk about someone who continued to influence events well after his time in uniform. In fact, I'm reminded one night when I was the director of the CIA, he invited my wife and me to a dinner party at his place in New York City, a lovely spot in the River House. And I noticed that Henry had had a couple of drinks that night. He was normally relatively abstemious. And in part because I'd just given him the CIA Director's Medal, and none of us ever, I mean, especially after you leave government, to get another medal is always a wonderful occasion. And I turned to him and I said, Henry, I wonder if I could ask a personal question. And he said, by all means, General. And I asked, what is it that worries you most personally? And he turned to me and he looked at me and he said, irrelevance. And it's very true. And I will tell you, probably along with a number of other people in this room who have reached that age where you wonder what kind of footsteps you've left in the sands of time, I also am trying to battle irrelevance. And so it's great to be here on this stage with you tonight.
Well, thank you, General. And I know that, that everyone in this room and everyone watching online is really grateful to have this time to learn from you. As Jim recently shared, the Nixon Foundation launched the American Civics Campaign, and I think that you have the unique distinction of being a voice that the American people trust on both sides of the aisle.
It's because I stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars.
So one of the key intellectual constructs that you've brought to the forefront of your own commands and teaching others is the idea that getting the big ideas right is the first order of magnitude. Could you share a little bit more about this and your 4 tasks?
So when I was between, I had 2-star, 3-star, 4-star tours in Iraq. I was literally present for the invasion and really continued all the way through, director of the CIA at the end of the decade when we pulled our final combat troops out of that country. And between the 3- and 4-star tours, when we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, finally having an intellectual foundation for what we actually needed to do and had been lacking. I mean, here we'd been engaged in counterinsurgency operations, and I know there are some in here undoubtedly who are actually in Iraq and Afghanistan, probably with me at various times. And Alan, great to see you again. We needed that foundation. It was desperate, and we also needed to overhaul every aspect of the preparation of our forces, our leaders, our equipment, our organizational structures, and so forth. But I also distilled an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership. That's the leadership at the very top. It is completely different, because the person at the top, first and foremost, has the responsibility of getting the big ideas right, crafting the right strategy. This sounds easy. You know, after all, in the military, you go to a basic course, an advanced course, a staff college, a war college, general officer training, all of this. And yet the record is very far from perfect. I mentioned Vietnam earlier, and I know there are a number of Vietnam veterans in here. And I'd actually like to pause for a second, because our country treated them terribly. They actually did what our country asked them to do, which was to report for duty when they were drafted. They did so. They served in a very, very tough, hard war. The conditions could not have been more miserable for those in the jungle under a rucksack with a helmet and rifle. And then they came home, and what did our citizens do? They spat upon them. And that was absolutely reprehensible. I think it's still a black mark on our society. And moreover, the Vietnam veterans, more than any other group in America, ensured that those that I was privileged to command in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the greater Middle East got the kind of welcome home that they never received. So tonight I'd like to ask that they stand up so that we can indeed thank them for their service many decades ago. Thank you. And worst of all, frankly, our senior leaders failed those under a rucksack. They did not get the big ideas right. 13 years passed before we actually crafted the right strategy, which should have been one that focused on security of the people, because then the enemy has to come to you, instead of thrashing around in the jungle trying to win a war of attrition with North Vietnam that we could not win. In fact, the civilians in Washington started asking, wait a second, you know, you said you'd reach a point where their casualties are so great, and we keep escalating, then they escalate, and that is exactly what happened. The achievements of search and destroy operations were really very ephemeral. We would clear an area, take control of it, and then leave, and of course the enemy would come back. So you have to get the big ideas right. You have to understand the nature of the war, and we did not in Vietnam. We told them that the big threat was what we faced in Korea, an invasion across the demilitarized zone. That wasn't the big threat. The big threat was the Viet Cong, the insurgents in the villages and the hamlets and the provinces. And it took us 13 years to finally craft the kind of comprehensive, all of our elements, diplomatic, military, intelligence together for a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. But by that time, Tet offensive had already taken place. It had undermined trust and confidence in our leaders in uniform, and it made it very, very difficult to achieve what we should have achieved much earlier in that war, noting that it was an extraordinarily difficult context. Got to get the big ideas right. Now, we've seen this brilliantly in certain instances, the British in the Falklands, Oman, Malaysia, the Americans with Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Panama, and at different times in Iraq and in Afghanistan as well, although we didn't always keep them right over time. But that's the first and foremost task, and a strategic leader has to do that. In conflict, it comes from understanding your forces, the enemy forces, the human terrain in which you're fighting, the physical terrain, how a country is supposed to operate, how it really operates, the neighborhood, outside involvement, all of this, and again, crafting the right strategy, not trying to turn a war into what we'd like it to be, a big unit war in Vietnam, but rather accepting it as it is. Having gotten the big ideas right, a strategic leader has to communicate them throughout the breadth and depth of the organization and all who have a stake in the outcome of that conflict. And that's a very, very large group of people. It's your host nation counterparts, your coalition partners, America's mothers and fathers, other countries' parents, spouses, and so forth, the press, Congress, and so on. But above all, to those that you're privileged to lead, because they're the ones who are operationalizing the big ideas at your level and turning them into reality outside the wire, doing what only they can do under body armor and Kevlar with a weapon, and that is engage the enemy and also engage the people. The third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership, actually. This is the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting the best and brightest, hanging on to them as long as you can. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you develop. None of these is the same, and they evolve, and you're constantly tweaking that. It's how you spend your time, your battle rhythm, as we called it, your schedule, and the substance of that schedule. It's the metrics that you use. And here we failed again. In Vietnam, the body count was the wrong metric. Yep, we need to kill enemy at times, and it's great that there's a ratio 10-to-1 or something like that, although that metric actually came to lose integrity, unfortunately, as well, and that undermined integrity throughout the entire operation and organization. And on your battle rhythm, you have to have meetings, events, activities that allow you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, how to tweak them as the conditions evolve, as you make progress or experience setbacks, as the context changes, and you do it again and again and again. But I'd come back to that very first task, which is absolutely crucial, and that is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy. The truth is, this is true in the business world, and I've been in one of the great investment firms of the world over the last 11 years, KKR, a partner for nearly 10 of those years, and I've watched in the private sector great examples of extraordinary strategic leadership. Jeff Bezos, Jack Ma of Alibaba, Reed Hastings of Netflix. It's a great example. Netflix, he really brought it into what it was, and I've discussed this with him, and he had a similar intellectual architecture for strategic leadership. And there were 4 incarnations of Netflix to illustrate this for you. The first was, the big idea is we're gonna put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, and we're gonna undercut Blockbuster, and we'll take market share away from them. And they did, so successfully that there's one Blockbuster left in the lower 48. It's in a famously contrarian place, Bend, Oregon. It refuses to allow its Blockbuster to die, and that is awesome, because those of my generation can take our grandkids there and show them what we used to do on a Friday night. That's the first big idea. And they communicate it, oversee it, and all this stuff. Second big idea, he notices that the context has changed. Broadband speeds have dramatically increased. So now we can allow consumers, customers to download movies. New big idea, works through, and in each case then competitors appear and they're all trying to tweak the same big idea. Then he has the big breakout moment, and that is we're going to create our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, all these other iconic series that we binge watched during the pandemic and all that stuff. And then the fourth big idea is we're gonna make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys not 1, but 2 major motion picture studios. And he's so successful, one of the great metrics of the world is Academy Award nominations, and he gets more of those for Netflix productions than any other major motion picture studio. Now, that latter category, I did take issue with one of the movies that was made. It was the one in which Brad Pitt played General Stan McChrystal, my partner in combat probably for, 6 years or something like that. It was particularly focused on his time in Afghanistan, and he just didn't get Stan McChrystal at all. He walked around like a little wooden soldier, he saluted stiffly, he had no sense of humor. I told all this to Reed, and I also said, Reed, I cannot believe that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. the movie was so bad, I only watch movies on international flights. And I've never been able to stay awake long enough to get to the little bit part where Russell Crowe plays me for some period of time. So I don't know how he did, but I really feel that Brad Pitt should have made the right choice.
That's wonderful. So General, in chapter 10, you talk about the future of wars. And I am thinking about a conversation that your friend and a great friend of this institution, Secretary Henry Kissinger, had with his biographer, Neil Ferguson, where he said, we are in the foothills of a new Cold War. The next year, he called it the mountain passes. And before Secretary Kissinger passed away, he said that the new Cold War will be more dangerous than the previous one. And I wondered how you are framing world order and how you are approaching the challenge of future conflict for the West.
Well, first of all, of course, what he was referring to is the competition between China and the US-led West. And there's no question that that is the most important issue of the day. People ask me, what is the biggest challenge out there? And I respond that it's all China all the time. But keep in mind that the use of the idea of a Cold War is not perfect. And I've had these discussions with Neil, who's a brilliant writer, brilliant speaker. Because, of course, in the original Cold War, we had absolutely, really no economic exchange, no trade with the Soviet Union. Every now and then we'd sell them some excess wheat to help our farmers or something like that, or maybe out of humanitarian concern, they couldn't feed their citizens. But that was about it. In this case, we are highly dependent on China, too highly dependent in a whole host of different ways. They are our #3 trading partner after the two partners on the North American continent with which we have a free trade zone, Mexico and Canada in that order. And we are the largest trading partner for them. And the bottom line is that they have a huge dependency on us. And it's often overlooked. Everyone thinks that we're just dependent on everything that they make, the manufacturing hub of the world. They can't feed their people or feed their livestock without that which they import from the United States. So that dimension is very, very different, but the complexities of this relationship are extraordinary. And the truth is that the continued growth of China and the more aggressive actions by China on the world stage, whether it's wolf warrior diplomacy, aggressive actions in the South and East China Seas, the LOC, killing Indian soldiers on the line of actual control in 3 separate major fights that they've had, economic coercion in countries like Australia, a whole host of different actions. And of course, in many respects, trying to undermine the important institutions that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon solidified, the rules-based international order led by the United States. This has transformed the world. When I joined KKR 11 years ago, you could describe the world as one of benign globalization, in which economics largely drove geopolitics, in which the barriers to trade, capital flows, investment, data flows were all being reduced, and global trade, or globalization, measured by global trade, was going up like that. 11 years later, we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries. Geopolitics are back with a vengeance. They very much are impeding, increasingly impeding economics. The barriers that were going down are all going up, and globalization has become globalization, and within it, actually much greater regionalization. That is that is seismic change. And it has enormous ramifications for abilities to invest in China. Numerous of the sectors rightly are off limits, whether it's chips, biotech, quantum, AI, you name it, anything that's dual use can be used military as well as civilian. So the transformation of the world is very, very significant. In fact, I would submit that the world right now faces the greatest number of challenges, at least since the end of the Cold War, if not World War II, and the greatest complexity of some of those challenges as well. And if you think of, say, the US as the guy in the circus who keeps a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, helped by our allies and partners, especially if we value them and treat them well, there are more plates in that tent, and one of those plates, the China plate, which is bigger than all the others put together, is far more complex than anything we've dealt with for many, many decades. That relationship is crucial. We have to ensure that it is as solid as it can be. It's described as one of severe competition by our National Security Advisor. We have to make sure it doesn't erupt into confrontation and military conflict. But there's still a Russia plate that is more menacing and problematic than in many decades. with its unprovoked and brutal invasion of its neighbor, Ukraine, whose independence they're trying to deny. And by the way, they won't stop there. Vladimir Putin's bent on reassembling as much of the former Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, as he can. Moldova would be next, then some of the Baltic states and so forth. The North Korean nuclear plate is still there, still problematic. The Iran, probably 3 plates. It's the drone and missile programs that they have, and they're providing thousands of drones to Russia. It is their support for malign actors in the region, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen terrorizing the Red Sea and forcing ships to go around Africa instead of through the Suez Canal, and then also Shia militias in Iraq and Syria and so forth. And then it's their nuclear program. I was not a massive fan of the Iran nuclear deal, but when we withdrew from it, I felt unwisely. They waited for a while to see if we would come back to it. They gave up, and they're now closer to a nuclear weapon than they ever have been, literally weeks from being able to refine weapons grade for the first time, although they have chosen not to do that. And I think, and I hope, it's because they believe what we have said, which is that we will not allow them to have a nuclear weapon. And in fact, it's publicly known that U.S. Central Command developed the plan to destroy the Iran nuclear program when I was the commander of that area of responsibility. There are individual Islamist extremist groups, some of which are more menacing than in a long time. The Islamic State Khorasan group, which has taken advantage of the Taliban takeover and the lack of security in some of the remote areas around Afghanistan and its rural areas, carried out an attack that killed 150 Muscovites and wounded many others in a theater there. They have inspired attacks from Iraq and northeastern Syria in Europe, most of which have been identified, thankfully, and preempted. There are other groups like that around the world. We learned the hard way that you have to keep an eye and pressure on these groups or else they can reconstitute. There are cyber threats of various types, nation state, criminal. The nation states are doing different actions. Some want to raise money, some want to steal all your personal identification information and intellectual property. Others are trying to put a finger on the scales of our election. Russia trying to influence, inflame debates that we have in social media and so forth. And of course, there are extremists who have cyber caliphates or virtual caliphates as well that are very problematic. Manifestations of climate change. I mean, I don't need to tell people in California that wildfires are worse than they've ever been before. I don't need to tell you that storms that used to be once in a century now come every other year. Sea rise, go to South Beach, Miami, and watch how many days of the year the water is over the road. All of these are very, very challenging, and they're getting more so. Look at the movement of millions of people, migration forced by the desertification of the Sahel in Africa. And who's the recipient of that? Obviously, in that case, it's Europe, although some also try to make their way across our southern border, which needs to be secured better. So again, all of these, and there are more, there's populism in various countries around the world that can be particularly challenging. You know, so you ask me, what's the situation right now? Again, more threats and more complex threats than at any time, at least since the end of the Cold War. And that means that US leadership is more important than it has been for many decades as well.
In your 4 tasks, you talk about effective communication. Could you share some historical examples that you think about with effective communication? And also, who are the great communicators that you see on the geopolitical stage today?
Well, you know, one of the really great communicators was somebody who said very little. We're going back now to the Civil War, but Ulysses S. Grant, who I believe is the greatest combat commander in the US Army in history, was a man of very, very few words. And yet he communicated brilliantly. He wrote, this is a day where you wrote all your own orders. He could see a battlefield in space and in time, and he could write out orders to all the different elements, directing them so that it was all synchronized, if you will, so that they knew how to carry these attacks out, these offensive operations. And of course, he was always on the offensive. I was mentioning during the dinner, he was the man who truly saved the Union, because he had demonstrated his skill at the tactical level as a 1-star general of the land between the lakes, then the brilliant maneuver battle at Vicksburg, where he took enormous risks, so much risk that his most trusted lieutenant, Sherman, insisted on an official letter in the file saying that he felt it was too risky, and yet they pulled it off, and they essentially encircled Vicksburg, took it down in a siege, delivered it on July 4th of 1863, as I recall, right about the time of Gettysburg as well. This is when Lincoln recognized the genius of this man. And someone cautioned Lincoln. He said, you know, Mr. President, he drinks. And Lincoln responded, please find out what he drinks and give it, to the other generals. At least he fights. And he was talking in particular, of course, about McClellan, who twice had the leadership, twice failed to do anything with it, and then ran against Lincoln in 1864. But then they bring Grant east. He's given control of all of the Union forces. For the first time, he crafts the brilliant strategy, gets the big ideas right, all of it for the entire theater, but in particular going after Lee relentlessly. And that strategy delivers the battles, the victories, Sherman at Atlanta, Savannah, and up the coast, Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, that convinced the American public that this war can be won a year after you had devastating draft riots in New York City that almost destroyed that great city. So again, what was the essence of what he did? Brilliant communication. The orders, his communications with President Lincoln, and the very few comments that he did make publicly, which were extraordinarily powerful. His memoirs, I think, are the most beautiful memoirs of any former military commander, and that's the essence of communication again. I'll tell you that when I took command of the forces in Iraq, it was desperate. That country was in a Sunni-Shia civil war. There were 53 dead civilian bodies every 24 hours due to violence in Baghdad, the capital of the country. Totally out of control. But I really did believe that we could do what we eventually did, what our soldiers actually accomplished, which was ultimately to drive violence down by nearly 90% in 18 months. And the real measure was that it continued to go down slightly, even as we began to withdraw our forces, all the way up to the very end, when we withdrew our final combat forces. And tragically, the Prime Minister almost immediately undid what we'd done with highly sectarian actions, which were tragic to watch as the CIA director at the time. But I had to communicate a sense that we could do that because the doubters were legion. Everybody in Congress questioned it, they criticized it. My own military chain of command didn't have faith that we could, many of the service chiefs just wanted to reduce the strain on their services. It's understandable. But as President Bush pointed out, when one of the service chiefs said, Mr. President, I'm afraid that you might break the Army, he said, General, I'll tell you what'll break the Army, and that's losing a war. And he was right. And he went all in on this with us, those of us out there in the battlefield, Ambassador Ryan Crocker and me in particular. And I remember crafting a phrase for the very first speech, which conveyed the essence of the biggest of the big ideas, was that we are going to have to live with the people to secure them. We had been doing operations and then leaving. We're going to do operations and we're going to stay. So it's clear hold and build, not clear and leave. We're going to take back control from the Iraqi security forces. The Prime Minister didn't want to see that happen. I said, we have to do that, sir. There's no choice. And then I said, you know, this is really hard, but hard is not hopeless. And it proved to be the case. I also wrote my own counterinsurgency guidance, and it was a series of admonitions. Secure and serve the people was big idea number one, and explained that we have to live with them to do that, create gated communities, 77 additional locations we had to fight for, just in the greater Baghdad area alone and many others around the country. The second was promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We have to reconcile with the rank and file. Third was pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly, which we did. Fourth was promote even greater civil and military integration. And then, you know, went on down. There was one that said walk. There was another that said take off your sunglasses, engage with the people. And then there was one, you know, this is a small unit war. This is where you have strategic lieutenants and sergeants who are out there carrying out tactical actions that can have strategic consequences. And so in line with that, there was one that said promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. And they did. So again, this is how you communicate. And, you know, I was more open to the press, I think, than any general of my generation. Some people appreciated that. For them, the term celebrity general was a compliment. Some in the next administration didn't quite see it the same way. They saw that as a bit of a threat, and it was a bit more of a pejorative term. But again, there was no choice. I realized that I had to be the face of the surge because, frankly, no one else had any credibility at that point in time, given the way the situation had deteriorated. Secretary of Defense was replaced, commanders replaced, the ambassadors replaced, Central Command commanders replaced. And that's what the ambassador and I had to do. And a lot of that is just sheer communication and allowing access, of course, also being visible to the troops. On my battle rhythm, at least 2 and sometimes 3 times a week, we would go out immediately after the morning update and link up with a unit somewhere in the field, either by a vehicle or a helicopter or a fixed-wing plane if it was a great distance, and we'd go on patrol with them and get a sense of what it was they were dealing with, sit down with them later, the company commanders, the captains who were mature and had been all in, at least in one previous tour. And I would give them my email address. And I'd say, if you're ever really frustrated with your chain of command that they're not taking seriously an issue that's serious to you, you email me. And I'll figure out how to shield you, but try to find out what's going on. And over time, I was getting 4 and 5 emails a week from those who are right down at the last level that actually knows every casualty by a face, not by a name or a number. And then we would dig into it and try to figure out how it was that we could resolve those issues. So again, it takes all of the above as you do this. And again, above all, though, there was actually, in dealing with the press, we also had a big idea. And the big idea was to be first with the truth. We want to beat the bad guys to the headline. They have the CNN field office dialed into their cell phones as we're shooting our way out of some engagement. And so do we. We want to beat them to the headline, but we want to do it with the truth. And we're not going to put lipstick on pigs. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. We're not going to spin. We're just going to tell the truth. And that was really important to our credibility as well. So again, a bit of a long way of pointing that out. In fact, I had a whole PowerPoint briefing, which is of course how general officers are authorized to communicate. It's a little amendment to the, the freedom of speech. Down it says general officers may use PowerPoint. And so I had one on dealing with the press, and it said, first of all, you can't win if you don't play. And it had a whole bunch of happy things, me on the cover of Time or this or that, or Petraeus is doing this. And then it said, you can't lose if you don't play. And there were some less happy ones, the ones for which I was raked over the coals, particularly one. I remember there was a headline in the Washington Post early on. I was just a 2-star then. And it said, the title was A Cross Between Pope and President, General Petraeus in Northern Iraq. It took me a long time to live that one down, but I'd actually said it to the journalist because we'd just done something that was so extraordinary, sort of the way I felt. We had just revived the entire western Nainoa province by reopening the border and also refilling an irrigation system of 280,000 acres, all of these things. And then the third conclusion was, but you gotta play. It's not a choice. You owe it to America's mothers and fathers, to those that you're privileged to lead, and again, get after it.
So you and your co-author, Andrew Roberts, have come together on this book. You're already working on your second book.
Well, the second edition, actually.
Well, the second edition, excuse me.
We just sent it to the press, and so we added a chapter on Gaza, and obviously updated the one in Ukraine and also on the future of war, because Ukraine is so dramatic in the way technology is changing the very nature of warfare. When a country produces 1 million drones in 12 months, do the math, you're throwing thousands of drones at the enemy every day, and that's crucial because the Russians vastly outnumber the Ukrainians, and that's the only equalizer. How does a country that has no navy sink over 1/3 the ships of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet? The answer is technology. First it was anti-ship missiles, then they moved out of range of that, then it's aerial drones that find them, and Ukrainian-made maritime drones that sink them. And they forced the Russian Navy out of the Western Black Sea, including withdrawing their final ship after centuries of using the port of Sevastopol for Russia. The final Russian ship had to leave that port in Crimea. and go around the corner and get out of the range. And now they're pursuing them in those areas as well. So technology has been extraordinary. By the way, by opening up the Western Black Sea, now Ukraine can export grain. It's crucial for their fiscal bottom line. They are about 25% of the world's grain exports, and it's crucial for food security for Egypt and other countries in North Africa. So again, technology is truly changing. I don't know about the character of war, but certainly the way war is conducted, and we're going to see much more of that over time. The truth is, over time, you're going to see a transformation of a force that in many respects, in our force in particular still, is a small number of large platforms that are incredibly, exquisitely capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and increasingly vulnerable. Because if you can see it, you can kill it, and you can see everything on the surface of the water and above nowadays. From that to a massive, almost infinite number of unmanned systems that increasingly will not be remotely piloted, they're going to be algorithmically piloted, and the human on the loop is going to become, or the human in the loop is going to become the human on the loop, the individual who determines what that machine is going to do, programs it, writes the algorithms and so forth, develops the conditions that it has to meet to take a particular kinetic or non-kinetic action. And that's probably summoning a drone right now. I still have some of those in my back pocket.
So for my last question, before handing it over to the audience for some questions, I wanted to ask you about the writing process. You and Roberts split up the chapters, I understand, but could you share what this was like to co-author a book and to do so with such an esteemed historian?
Yeah, I mean, this is his 20th book. It's his first with a co-author. Again, he called me up when Russians invaded and said, we need a book that provides the military history context. Would you like to do it with me? I've been looking for a book that would allow me to have a vehicle to write about the two wars that I was privileged to command and to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton at the 10-year mark after withdrawing, and now many subsequent decades with declassification of papers, further scholarship, further memoirs, and so forth. And I remember, so HarperCollins won the bidding. It was a very handsome advance, particularly important for him because he lives in a beautiful White House in Belgravia, as you noted, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, not the most needy of districts in London, but the housing prices are pretty high, and so this is how he makes a living. I actually, as a partner at KKR, I gave it all away to various nonprofits. But I remember we did a video conference with a Zoom with HarperCollins, and the editor, our future editor, said, now how are you going to divvy up the writing process? And Andrew quickly responded, well, General Petraeus is going to write about the countries he invaded, plus Vietnam, and he said, I'll sort of fill in the rest. But it was quite a collaboration. I obviously put in front, right up front, the intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, because that became the prism through which we examined each of the conflicts that we look at. Because the fact is that the side typically that has the best strategic leadership generally is the one that prevails. And so that was how we went about this. And then depending on who had the most expertise on something, really had a lot to do with how it went. For example, I'd actually been to El Salvador during that civil war. I'd done Bosnia, I did Haiti, I did, obviously, again, Iraq. And the other interesting development was when we submitted the chapters for Iraq and Afghanistan, they were in the third person. That's how you normally write history. And the editor came back and said, you know, this just doesn't work. You say, and then General Petraeus went to the Iraqi White House and confronted Prime Minister Maliki on this issue, and then Petraeus did this. He said, look, you wrote these chapters. Andrew certainly edited, contributed, and so forth. But why don't you put a little asterisk at the front that says, Petraeus drafted these, and therefore it's in the first person. And so, very different for a history. Those two chapters alone are in the first person. I also narrated them, by the way. And I learned that narrating is a heck of a lot harder than I thought it would be. I actually lost my voice at one point. I had to go gargle with hot water and salt. So my hat's off to the great narrators of the world that do these things. But it was a delightful process because he's a delightful guy. He's incredibly scholarly. He has tremendous recall. What's really remarkable, frankly, and I love being on stage with him, he's got a great sense of humor, that wonderful self-deprecating British sense of humor, and all kinds of witty phrases and so forth. But he also has the unique capacity to do something that I cannot do, and that is perform after drinking. I think it's a uniquely British characteristic. I've tried it once or twice. It doesn't go real well for me. He's still at least the 95 percentile after a couple of drinks, and I envy him greatly in that. Especially because, you know, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, the greater Middle East, we had what was called Central Command General Order No. 1. And that meant that you didn't drink in the war zones. And so, you know, I spent something like 8 years in these war zones not drinking, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. But I can't on the night, so I've not yet had a drink this evening. I want to report to you, but I will afterwards. Hopefully, by the way, while I'm signing all their books. I forgot to make that request earlier, if they can go back down to the dining room and.
Well, we are all so grateful that you made time to be with us tonight. Nazim, I think.
Yes, can we get a round of applause for our gentleman right over here? So I don't have many rules when it comes to the Q&A. Just raise your hand, and then I'll hold on to the mic. It does not leave my hand. But the very first question is from one of our youth ambassadors here at the Richard Nixon Foundation. What's your question, Josh?
Hi. General, as
You
a grand
never
strategist...
let's go with the microphone. This is rule number 1 for the person with the microphone. You always keep a tight grip on it.
It does not leave the hand.
Sorry. General, as a grand strategist and commander-in-chief for the Iraq and Afghanistan operation, what is one thing that we as a country can improve on right now?
I guess, you know, it always comes back to big ideas. And the fact is that we learned in Afghanistan in particular that you can't wait for 8 years to get the big ideas right. What happened is we had a brilliant campaign to topple the Taliban because they refused to eliminate the Al-Qaeda sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned. So we had to go in to eliminate that sanctuary. We had to topple the regime that allowed it on Afghan soil. And we very quickly shifted focus to Iraq, and we really didn't return properly to Afghanistan until the surge was complete and the forces were drawn down. And we looked at this and we said, oh my gosh, this is not going real well. It's interestingly, I did an assessment for Secretary Rumsfeld on my way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq. And I came back and I was stunned because the level of violence was very, very low in Afghanistan. In fact, we would drive ourselves around in Kabul in thin-skinned vehicles. I mean, you'd never get away with that in Iraq. The violence was orders of magnitude higher. And yet, Afghanistan was way behind Iraq because it had been largely starved for resources. And there were innumerable deficiencies in what was going on. And it really wasn't for 8 years that we didn't craft the right comprehensive, integrated civil military counterinsurgency campaign that we should have been executing, and then resource it. It took 9 years to get all the inputs right. In fact, I was the commander by that point in time. General McChrystal gets a lot of the credit. I added a number of other initiatives and the organizational architecture and some other pieces, but we didn't even get close to the right level of forces until late 2010, and then the president who had announced the buildup announced the drawdown of those forces in the same speech, which is something that escaped me in terms of logic. If you're in a contest of wills with an enemy, why do you tell them that you want to leave? And it undermined our effort there. And within 6 months of getting it all right, we started a drawdown, and that drawdown increasingly became determined not by the objective conditions on the battlefield. We had very rigorous conditions for what should be present for you to draw down. Rather, it became the conditions in Washington, and that's not the way to do it. George W. Bush did not do it that way once he took over the Washington end of the war after replacing Secretary Rumsfeld with Secretary Gates. So it comes back, get the big ideas right. Where are there places where we don't have the right big ideas? Well, we've done very admirably in leading the world in the response to Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine. But then we have delayed critical decisions far too long, and there are still a couple of those. We're limiting the Ukrainian ability to use the longest range weapon. We've provided the Army Tactical Missile on Russian soil. I don't think this is escalatory. The Ukrainians are hammering Russian soil every single night. They don't even know whether it's our ATACMS or their drones or other rockets and systems. And repeatedly, we delayed the decision on F-16s, we delayed the decision on the Army tactical missile system, on the multiple launch rocket system, on the M1 tank, which delayed the German. So all of these, again, let's recognize the inevitable and make the decision rather than delay, delay, delay. I thought we got it wrong on Afghanistan. We could have sustained our effort there forever. I don't believe that endless wars have to be ended, actually. There were 3,500 US troops on the ground. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. Sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. If you don't lose a soldier in 18 months, what's unsustainable about that? And it's down from 103,000 at the height of the war when I was privileged to command it. Americans, only Americans. Another 50,000 NATO and non-NATO. And the cost was $25 billion, it's a lot of money, but $850 billion defense budget, you can afford that. Especially when you know that I said if we pull out, we will regret this decision, and I fear a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces, who had fought and died 16 times our number until the moment they realized nobody was coming to the rescue. Because not only did we withdraw our forces, we withdrew the 17,000 Western contractors necessary to maintain the overly sophisticated helicopters that Congress insisted we buy for them, rather than continue to buy the Russian version, old stuff, analog, which they could maintain. Nowhere near as capable as our Blackhawks, but they didn't need to be as capable as our Blacks. So again, these are sort of big ideas that we did not get right. With respect to China, I think we are actually, I think bipartisan support for the right kind of approach to China. It started with the previous administration, it has continued with this administration. I don't care who gets elected in November, we'll continue to carry out what is essentially a comprehensive, integrated, whole of governments with an S on the end, our allies and partners together, effort to manage that relationship and to ensure that deterrence is rock solid. So again, just keep questioning, do we have the big ideas right? That's the lesson that people should take, because if you don't get the big ideas right, I don't care how valiant the soldiers on the battlefield are, as they were in Vietnam, how full of initiative and drive and determination they may be, we will not have met our responsibility as senior leaders to them.
All right, we have another question right over here.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, classmate, how are you?
Good to see
friend,
you. Richard Downey, the president of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. Sir, it's great to see you.
Dr. Richard Downey, Colonel retired Richard Downey.
Good to see you, sir.
Great to see you again.
Hey, sir, you mentioned that that in your updated version of the book that you're going to address Gaza. And I wonder if you could foreshadow a little bit for us what your analysis is in terms of the way that the Israeli military has fought the war, as well as the political impact of how the Israeli military has fought the war. Thank you.
So let's just again start with the big ideas. Israel has said that its objectives are, understandably, given the horrific events of October 7th. Keep in mind, to put this in perspective, we lost not quite 3,000 Americans and other citizens in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent for us of what Israel sustained would be 42,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. So let that sink in and think what our response would have been. And I think understandably, they said we have to destroy Hamas. That means render them incapable of accomplishing their mission without reconstitution. You cannot allow them to reconstitute. And keep them from governing Gaza again, and also, of course, get your hostages back. The problem is that the campaign that they are pursuing is not achieving that objective. It is degrading Hamas very substantially, but they are doing clear and leave operations, as we were prior to the surge in Iraq. In fact, I just wrote an article, co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs on what they should be doing based on the lessons that we learned the hard way in Iraq. You have to do clear, hold, and build. Yes, that means they have to reoccupy Gaza. But if you have to achieve security, there is not security in Gaza. And so who is running Gaza after a fashion? Remnants of Hamas that keep coming back together. And by the way, because of the loss of civilian life, it's not hard to recruit Hamas 2.0. Yes, they can't arm themselves because Israel has sealed the borders and controlling that, but they're not meeting the responsibility in a lot of ways that, again, you'd want to see done. Before we did the surge operations, say in Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, Mosul, and so forth, we said, we're going to improve your lives citizens. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to get Al-Qaeda out of them. And we are going to clear an area, a neighborhood. We're going to create a gated community, entry control point, biometric ID cards, and then we're going to do it again and again and again. Fallujah alone, 300,000 people, put a wall around the entire city to begin with, and then had 12 or 13 gated communities within it. And all of a sudden, it completely comes back to life. Because once you have security, you can actually deliver humanitarian assistance. You can actually restore basic services. You can begin reconstruction of damaged infrastructure. And Gaza is very, very heavily damaged and destroyed. Israel does not have a counterinsurgency field manual. They don't have a large force. I understand all this. I know their Minister of Defense well and discussed this with him. But I think it's inescapable that what they have to do, you start in the north, come a mile down, east-west wall. We put up walls that size every single night in multiple locations in Baghdad. A couple of north-south walls. You have 3 or 4 gated communities now. You clear them very, very carefully. Everybody in there that deserves it gets a biometric ID card. The bad guys are identified, ideally. And then now you can start bringing in, again, humanitarian assistance. Now non-government organizations can come in. Palestinian security forces can thicken them and begin to take over. You can start little small institutions. Arabs will come in now. They're not coming in if there's not security. They're not going to fight Hamas for Israel. And I was just in all the Gulf states, and so that's not going to happen. But now they can actually make life better for the Palestinian people, which I think is a crucial component of a sustainable solution. What you have right now is a short-term, very significant achievement in degrading the capabilities of Hamas very dramatically. They can't shoot dozens of rockets at Israel at this point in time, or not many anyway. But you need a sustainable situation, not a short-term solution. And you just keep repeating the process, rinse and repeat, you do it. And then, by the way, then you cut entry control points to the rest of Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces control those coming in and out. You have to have biometric ID cards. They're fantastic at that. We use biometric ID cards as well. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's very tough, and it's going to get tougher as you go further south because the enemy's denser as you get to the midway, Khan Yunis, and then Rafah. But that's what the big ideas should be, in my view, if they truly intend to destroy Hamas and prevent them from governing again. And again, I've laid this out publicly. I've offered to them privately initially. And I think if at some point in time, this will appear so necessary and inevitable that you'll look back with hindsight and ask why they didn't do it from the very beginning. Yes, noting that our administration doesn't appreciate this approach, doesn't want them to reoccupy. Israelis understandably are reluctant to reoccupy, but I don't see an alternative to it. And I have done a little bit of this stuff over the years, and we learned some pretty hard lessons along the way.
Thank you so much. We have one last question all the way to the back of the room right here.
Okay.
Good evening again, General Petraeus, Colonel Retired Alan Dawson from Orange County here. Glad to see you again.
Great to see you again. Thanks for all you did in uniform.
Absolutely,
one
sir.
of the members of the tribe back in the day.
Absolutely. Sir, since we were both Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, you and I both know that there is no way that we could have done what we did without the support of our local national partners there. People that risked their lives as interpreters,
Yep.
working in dining facilities, I mean, you name it, everything.
Yep.
We are failing those folks,
Yep.
in particular in Afghanistan.
Yep.
I was speaking with somebody that I served with in Afghanistan today, and all but broke down in tears regarding an individual that we are failing
Yep.
right now. If we could develop a policy to how to resolve this, to how to solve this bureaucratic process, what would that look like? What should our government be doing? Because you're a forward-thinking person.
Sure.
How do we fight
Yep.
a war in the future
Sure.
if we failed the people in the
Yep.
past? Because nobody will be able
Yep.
to support us like they did, because they know in the end they will not be able to trust us.
So the battlefield interpreters, or TERPs for short, were crucial to what it was we did on the ground. They're there with every platoon leader, every small unit that's out on patrol. Our son was a rifle platoon leader, second lieutenant, when I was the commander in Afghanistan. He was in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, then went back several more times with the Rangers with Special Ops. Every time they went outside the wire, their TERP was with them. And these TERPs did the equivalent of 4 or 5 tours, because that's how they made a living. And they're risking their lives, sharing risk and hardship with our soldiers on the ground. Many of them, sustain various injuries over time, endless improvised explosive device attacks and everything else. And we said, if you do this for 2 years, we will give you a special immigrant visa, and we'll get you and your family out of Afghanistan. And we failed to meet our moral obligation to them. When that chaotic withdrawal was conducted, there were probably 150,000 interpreters and family members, somewhere somewhat more than 20,000 interpreters that we failed to get out, and then their family members. And we've been getting out a few thousand a year since then, sometimes more, sometimes less. I'm on the board of No One Left Behind, which is dedicated to helping at least as many of these as we can. There are some others that come out other ways. And we just need to accelerate that process. The fact is we've been overly cautious in that regard. I understand the reservations about people coming. Look, these were right by our side, and yet they're going through a vetting process that could take them a year or more and everything else. So again, that's a failure. I will say with some degree of quiet pride that the one organization that did get out virtually all of those that worked with that organization, particularly in high-risk operations, was the CIA. They had an advantage. They had an outside base that was not besieged by tens of thousands of Afghans desperately trying to get onto an aircraft. They assembled there quietly. They had helicopters. They flew them inside the perimeter and in an orderly way took them onto the planes and so forth. And then as a final, when they finally stopped flying and parked the helicopters, they had a special gate that they could open where no one was. They drove up, went through it, and closed it, and put them on the aircraft. Sadly, that was not the case for so many other categories of Afghans, many of whom, again, had shared enormous risk and hardship with our men and women in uniform, our diplomats, our other endeavors that we had. And you're right, Alan, that if you don't do that, who's going to volunteer next time? Are they going to trust the United States? We did better in Iraq because we didn't have the kind of chaotic circumstances that we had there. And frankly, the pressure wasn't as great for Iraqi interpreters to leave. There are certain categories, certain parts of the country where that was very risky and they did have to leave. My own interpreter from the first year we got him out, he's, and then a tribute to the great American dream. So he comes to the United States and he's now managing, I think it's 5 banks for one of the major banks of America in California. So the American dream is alive and well. And let me end perhaps with 2 notes. One is that people ask me what gives you confidence in the future, given all the hyper-partisanship in Washington and the seeming inability of Congress to do anything and all the rest of this stuff. And at the end of the day, I think it is actually what has made America great again and again and again is a certain number of elements of our system, which above all, give real incentives for people to start businesses, to help them grow, to prosper from those, and to foster innovation and entrepreneurship and all the rest of that. And that is truly remarkable. And right now, we're in a bit of a productivity boom. Artificial intelligence may be overhyped in some ways, but it is going to be transformative in what it does. The other is that I want to thank all of you. Orange County in particular has been one of those locations in our country that has repeatedly gone well above everywhere else in the country in ensuring that our men and women in uniform and their family members and our veterans were appreciated, even if you disagreed with the policies that we were implementing. And I was reflecting on this particularly in one occasion during the second year of the surge. We conducted the largest ever re-enlistment ceremony in military history. 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. This is in a war zone, mind you. And I was the re-enlistment officer. So I'm stating the oath they recited after me. And I'm looking out at the sea of uniforms, ironically in one of Saddam's great palace domes, and they completely fill it. It's spilling over. It actually makes the front page of the New York Times the next day above the fold. It's quite a photo. And as I'm looking out there, I'm asking, what is this all about? And I realize, I mean, it's not the stock options for sure. And at that time, in July 4th, 2008, we didn't yet know that the economy was about to go off a cliff. Unemployment was at historic lows still. So it wasn't that. There were plenty of opportunities, it seemed. And it was really the essence of it was that these great young men and women were serving our nation at a time of war, and they felt privileged to perform a mission larger than self, and a privilege to perform it with others who roughly felt the same way. But there was another element, and that was that they knew that their fellow Americans back in the US, again, appreciated what they were doing and the sacrifices that they and their family members were making, even if there was a disagreement about what it was, that the policy that we were actually implementing. No place in America did that better than this place right here, and I'd like to end on that note by thanking you for all you've done. Thank you. Privilege, you bet.
General Oliver, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is Conflict, and General Petraeus will sign all of your books in the Annenberg Court in the front lobby. Thank you for coming, thank you for your support, and good night.